and I think he adds a lot to this program both now and this afternoon. So, John?
Thank you, JB. Well, I'm in the same spot I was yesterday. I'm not going to mention what it is I stand in between, but I am going to stay on the topic of food and tell you a little bit about my fortune. This is no joke. So 2 days ago in Blacksburg, I'm eating Chinese for lunch. I get to the end of my meal, open my fortune cookie, and what do I find? The fortune. Everybody loves progress, but nobody likes change. And I thought, how appropriate for the next 2 days. So wanted to share this with you from a fortune cookie opened in Blacksburg, 2 days ago. And really, I think it gets at the kind of point or the underlying purpose of my presentation, which is to speak more to the human factors related to the potential adoption and the management of silvopasture systems. I'm not going to talk about those systems so much. I'm going to talk more about what we know in terms of some of the research we've done and some of the interactions we've had with producers related to their perceptions of silvopasture, their potential interests, the objectives that they have, and how those might relate to those systems and what they can provide. Now, I have this nice graphic here with the monolith, and that's to remind me, to remind all of you, that landowners and resource professionals are not monolithic. Oftentimes we say the landowners as if they are a monolith, or the resource professionals as if they are monolithic. But in fact, we know, and you all do, that our landowners are very diverse. They have a great deal of difference in terms of their objectives, in terms of their approaches to land management, and also the resource base that they work with. And we're also diverse, but I think that's one of our strengths, and I'd like to commend the diversity in this room and all of you coming together to learn about the possibility to work together on these more complex agroforestry systems. And I think we have, or we've gotten a feel for it, particularly this morning with the presentations, that silvopasture as an agroforestry practice has unique and complex issues or sets of considerations related to the implementation and management of those systems. And this applies to the landowners, as I've kind of already highlighted, resource professionals, but also in terms of our policymakers and how they think about landscape management and the directives that they may foster and develop to support sustainable management on the landscape that's both productive and also offers that conservation benefit. And then lastly, some of our funders as well. But I think we're making some progress, and I'm going to get to that toward the end of my presentation in terms of where we fall out with respect to the policymakers' understanding of silvopasture and the funders' interest in potentially supporting some of those practices. Now, the focus of my presentation will be primarily on landowners and adoption, but I'm also going to talk a little bit about what we know from research related to folks like you, so you kind of get a sense of what we've learned relative to some of the social science that we've done working with resource professionals. So what we know and what is underway. Well, basically what I'll address is what landowners know and need based on a survey of the literature that we've conducted. Also, how professionals can help those that are interested in adopting, so those that have not yet adopted but are interested, and also those that have adopted. So we have some confirmation, we have some technical support over time to continue to assist those landowners that are managing those silvopasture systems. And then lastly, what is happening presently in Virginia and beyond. So we have a little bit more of a regional or national scope in terms of situating what it is that we're considering today. And I'll talk about awareness and interest, some of the results we have along those lines, perceived benefits and challenges, the needs of adopters and potential adopters, and then lastly cover those initiatives. So agroforestry, right? So John, this morning, situated silvopasture is one of kind of our 5 primary temperate agroforestry practices, along with things like forest farming and alley cropping. Well, what we know from research related to landowner awareness, resource professional awareness, is that it is typically very low. That also holds for foresters, policymakers, so on and so forth. So agroforestry is, say, in terms of a temperate practice and being formalized, around 30 years old. Okay, so it's not a new opportunity or a new approach, but there's still limited awareness. So that is a challenge. Now in the South, in particular, related to silvopasture, we see that that falls out in the middle to bottom in terms of understanding and practice on the part of landowners relative to some of the other agroforestry practices. Okay? However, almost half are interested in these systems. So when you ask them, is this something you might be interested in? We see almost half saying that's the case. And in general, we know it's one of the more commonly referenced or discussed agroforestry practices. So we talk a little bit about alley cropping, for instance. That's not something that kind of predominates in terms of the discussion. I can tell you based on personal experience that I see forest farming and silvopasture as some of the key drivers in terms of the agroforestry discussion. And that has been increasing over time. So what do we have to tell folks related to silvopasture and agroforestry more generally? Well, I noted that it's about 30 years old in terms of being formalized as a land management strategy. And in the past 20 years or so, there has been some notable progress in terms of the basic science, looking at both the production benefits and also the conservation or ecosystem services that agroforestry systems can provide. And silvopastures have played a great role in terms of fleshing out some of that science that we have. So much so now that when we look across all the benefits at the farm scale in terms of air quality, water quality, soil conservation, and this relates specifically to ecosystem services, we see that the agroforestry systems have been demonstrated through basic science to provide those benefits to the landowner. And we've also then been introduced to this morning the opportunities to enhance production, right, through the optimization, the combination of those different component parts, the trees, the livestock, the forage base, specifically speaking in terms of silvopasture. So awareness and adoption, those are some of the biggest hurdles right now. We have a decent science base, okay? We can look at some budgets, we can look at some of the economics, we can look at some of the conservation facets, and we see that there are those benefits. But folks, like I've noted already, don't have a good solid understanding. And honestly, we still need to do some work, okay? I know it seems kind of hackneyed, right? We hear this all the time. More research is needed, more research is needed. But that is the case still. So we've made some notable progress, but there are still some unanswered questions. Okay, just out yesterday, all right, in the field, those questions were brought up. We had good discussions, some people scratching their head about some of the different issues. But that's what we need to do. We need to come together and address those things. That helps in turn drive some of the research questions, okay, which can help flesh out and better codify the practice so that we can in turn communicate the benefits and the practice to landowners in a confident way. Now, nationally speaking, we're not talking about agroforestry as a panacea or something that's going to take over the world. It's not like we want to go and put silvopasture everywhere. Like Sid noted, it's not for everyone. It definitely isn't for everyone. Okay? So you need to match the practice with the practitioner, and that's critical, and that's where the resource professionals come into play. And Sid also noted that you serve as a linchpin for communication between the practice, between the basic science, and those practitioners that have expressed an interest and potentially want to adopt. And so this 5% target has been noted nationally. 5% of the land base is an objective, and I think a reasonable one in terms of agroforestry practices as we move forward to try and work on change, okay, to achieve that progress that we all like so much. Okay, in terms of landowners, I'm going to kind of tackle 3 questions here. Let me just grab a sip of my water. And the first question is, who is interested and why? All right, so we have studies that have occurred primarily in the last decade. We have to do some that go back a little bit farther than that. But get at the question of who is interested and why in terms of silvopasture. All right, so we pulled out that information. What we know in terms of those that are less interested is that we want to think about absentee owners, right? Absentee owners, this is an intensive, intentional process. Okay, a great deal of oversight is required. Absentee owners are not there, so typically they seem to be like less interested landowners. Non-operators, so those that have more extensive objectives, have shown time and again, or at least through our buckle study, that they are not as interested in silvopasture system. Older farmers. Okay, so Sid asked a question, when's the best time to plant a tree? 20 years ago, right? So what we see is that older farmers are not necessarily as interested in these systems. However, we do have different cohorts, different generational cohorts of landowners and operators out there. And some of the younger ones can think in terms of a kind of longer-term objective. All right? So thinking about short-term outcomes, but also long-term outcomes and where trees may fit into that particular approach to managing land. And then lastly, tenant farmers. Tenant farmers, you know, that's maybe something that's more ephemeral, shorter lived. Right? They're here, they're leasing, they're moving along, so they don't actually own the land. So they also express limited interest in silvopasture. Now let's flip it around. Who is interested in silvopasture as far as we can tell from some of this survey research? Multiple objective owners. And I would say in many cases that defines the larger base of our land ownership. We have wildlife objectives. We have, you know, the good feelings associated with stewardship of the land. You have production objectives, and those can all be bundled within one owner. And I think we have a growing class of multiple objective owners, maybe those moving outside of just focusing specifically on finances. Now, some of that might be related to the out-migration. You guys are probably aware that there's a little bit of that going on, maybe actually not just a little bit, but quite a bit of folks moving out from population centers, right? Maybe retiring from their corporate job, moving out to the landscape. They've got a little bit more discretionary income. They're thinking in terms of the whole property. They've got multiple objectives. They want to dabble a little bit. Not to say, hey, look, hobby farmers, right? This is an intensive system. Some of them could potentially make it work. Keep in mind 5%. But also some of those that just think more broadly in terms of what they like to do with their property. The new producers, I think this also kind of goes to the out-migration. I think we also have some rural base that's coming up, thinking in terms of kind of maintaining the culture and the practices in those rural areas. Silvopasture could be an opportunity for them. They tend to express greater interest. And then lastly, intergenerational forest grazers. Right? We know that's a very common practice in terms of cattle management or livestock management in general. Now, those that have had experience in the past of, say, what did Sid call it? Letting the cows out into the woods or something along those lines. They've had experience in the past. Now, learning a little bit more about silvopasture and thinking maybe there's a more efficient way to go about this kind of forest grazing scenario to expand, say, the forage base, the opportunities to continue to produce cattle. And let's think about maybe managing that timber component as well, because we know forest grazing is not a silvopasture because really not always addressing that forest management angle in addition to the other objectives. So that's who, you know, in general we know more interested and less interested. Now we ask the question, why? You know, what are they saying about why am I interested? Another income stream compatible with livestock. And I think we could probably spin off of what I just touched on in terms of the intergenerational forest grazers. Wow, so we've just been, you know, in the back 40 setting cattle out. And I think a couple years ago, actually, I was at the Shenandoah Valley AREC for a field day. We were talking a little bit about some of the forest management activities that are underway out there. And there were 150 producers. And I asked the question, you know, raise your hand if you consider yourself to be an active forest manager. Well, three hands went up out of 150. Well, that's limited, right? But the opportunity to say, look, let's focus on forest management. A lot of you do have woodlands. You might be using them in terms of forest grazing or not using them at all, but potentially the integration provides an opportunity to add an income stream. Also, more completely utilized fertilizer inputs. Now, I touched on this earlier too, right? So just by the nature of fertilizing the forage, you also have benefits to allow some of that that's not efficiently used or captured to go into the trees so you have an additional product. Avoiding regulation for non-point source pollution. All right? Now, that's a huge benefit of silvopastures. Adding additional root biomass into those systems right, does quite a deal in terms of soil conservation. You can realize some great benefits. Adding small animals to diversified systems. Okay, so some trees may be out there, you have the forage, bringing those animals into play. And aesthetics and wildlife. Right, Sid noted 340% increase, and he thinks and attributes a lot of that to the fact that there was a very much visual quality benefit in terms of establishing that silvopasture. And the wildlife, time and again, I don't care if you're a forest owner, you're a pasture owner, you've just got 3 acres behind your house, you talk to these landowners, and wildlife is consistently a top objective. And the benefits related to those trees in the system can be pretty substantial in terms of wildlife. And then lastly, forestry experience, kind of going back to those 3 or 4. Yeah, it's limited in terms of those that consider themselves active managers, but we see those that have had some forestry experience and have worked with multiple consultants, right, to include those that manage forests, having a greater interest in silvopasture systems. Now, what do they think about silvopasture systems? So, what we found is that, or the literature shows, is that stewardship and satisfaction is prized as a top strength of silvopasture, followed closely by, and this makes sense, right, diversification of income and risk reduction. Okay, so a lot of landowners take great pride in what it is they do. Yes, they need to have the finances to support and maintain viable management systems. But hey, this is something that they express as a great potential outcome for silvopasture systems. Opportunities, what do they think? Wildlife and environmental conservation being one. Farm buffering, right? So having a diverse portfolio, not just going whole hog into one system as a monoculture, but because of that, the different products, the diversification, having some buffer in terms of the viability of the farm. And I have a great story from a student that was in my agroforestry course a few years back. They maintained some trees in the back section of some of their pasture areas. He said, a lot of the other landowners thought, why do you still have those trees back there? And they managed them a little bit. They were not fully mature, but there was a serious drought one summer, and he relayed this story to the class. Serious drought, so much that a lot of the grass had died back. The cattle were starting to suffer. The trees still had lush crowns. They dropped some of those trees for forage to bridge through some of that difficult period. All right, now they lost those trees in terms of potential timber value. They still captured the wood for firewood use and on-farm purpose, but they were able to provide an additional forage base because they had those in there. So that's an example of a farm being buffered by having some diversification. And long-term income. So that's been emphasized in earlier presentations. As far as challenges are concerned, soil quality and regulation. So a lot of landowners said, I'm not sure my site's good for supporting trees in certain areas, and I wonder what might happen in terms of regulating the systems. Complexity and infrastructure. Okay, those are huge challenges. The machinery, the equipment that it takes to do some of this may need to be adapted. You may have to have different systems. And you're talking about this, you start layering different component species in these systems, and it's you have more pieces in the puzzle to manage, so the complexity can increase. And this is a huge one. Culture and time, right? We've talked about how we've kind of segmented ourselves. For scores of years, landowners have worked in terms of their production systems to pull trees out, pull trees out, pull trees out. So there is an aversion. Jason Fisher told a great story at an open open lands meeting that was at the Blackstone about your grandmother, right, and the relationship to some tobacco farming and the trees and that type of thing. And it's true, that cultural impediment is still there. But as awareness increases, likelihood of breaking down some of those cultural impediments and finding those that are willing to take on some of that complexity can increase. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about a study, and I want to bring it back to Virginia here, because a lot of that literature primarily related to the Southeast, but from Florida, we had some stuff from Georgia, some things from Virginia. But I want to focus in on a study that I was involved in that included producers and trees. Now, it's not related to silvopasture systems, but it was planting native fruit and nut trees in creek sides on their property. So it had to do with taking some area out of production and putting trees in. The study found that it's the perceived risk that is most influential in terms of a producer's interest. So if they perceive a great deal of risk with these systems, okay, they're less likely to be interested in them. I think that holds true for a lot of agroforestry, to include silvopasture. And this study is in press right now with the Journal of Soil and Water Conservation, so it'll be coming out early 2014. And here's where it occurred. So 3 sub-basins, the Smith Creek in the North Fork Shenandoah, okay, the Catawba Creek sub-basin, Upper James River watershed, and the Lower Reed Creek in the Upper New. So we stretched across 3 sub-basins in Western Virginia. We surveyed about 180 landowners, and we segmented those landowners based on how they look. And by that I mean, what are you doing? Do you have cattle on your property or not? How are you watering those cattle? So we had these different groups, and what we found, and I'm going to highlight, are the results related to those livestock operators. Those folks that we were able to pull out and say, okay, these people have cattle on their property. What do they think about taking some of their, forage base out and put it in the trees? And what they said was that they want to see emphasis on production objectives in terms of making the case. I mean, this makes sense. These people are involved in these kind of intensive systems. They're not passive, extensive landowners, so they need to see the production objectives clearly outlined and the benefits if you're going to make the case. However, it was interesting because they were not altogether averse to using trees. They just want to know how those trees are going to fit in to the overall production outcomes on their property. So they can't just say, the trees are going to be good for you, put them in. No, they want to know, okay, if I use them, what is the utility in those trees, and how does it relate to the overall productivity? So they really made it clear to us in terms of what they expressed that they're keen on understanding the costs and benefits. And we still have some work to do in terms of silvopasture and agroforestry more generally. But they're not averse to it. The trees can be a crop. They can produce products. They can provide benefits. We just need to be able to kind of articulate how it fits into those production objectives. So that's Virginia. I'm going to move on, or an example related to riparian buffers, but I'm going to move on to this third question, and that is, what do landowners need? Let's talk first about potential adopters. So these are individuals who have not yet adopted these systems. Well, this is based on the diffusion of innovation, which is a kind of a Bible for extension folks. I don't know those that are involved in extension. But it really defines the process of how somebody kind of makes a decision to adopt something or not. And it kind of has some kind of clear steps. The first thing is, and they're intuitive, you got to know something about what it is you're going to potentially adopt, right, or make a decision about. But there's different types of knowing. Awareness, just being aware of silvopasture, for instance, right? That's knowing a little bit more than maybe you did. And we know that our landowners don't necessarily have a good deal of information in terms of awareness or information at all. How to. So now you know a little bit about it. How do you do it, right? How do you do this? And how do you do it in a way that resonates so that you have a clear understanding of the relationship to production and viability of any given property? And then lastly, principles. Right, so these are things for us to keep in mind as you're communicating with your clients. Right, principles. What are the important benefits or the attributes? What benefits do silvopasture provide in terms of production and conservation? What are the principles driving that particular arrangement? The next step. All right, now you know a little bit about it. You kind of have an understanding of how you might do it, right, and why the principles. Now you got to have a reason. All right, relative advantage. Can I get an advantage out of doing this as opposed to, say, doing something more conventional or in a monoculture fashion? Compatibility. Now, this goes back to matching the practice with the practitioner. There's going to be a whole host out there that say, this isn't compatible with what I want to do. But there are those that are interested. And among those that are interested, well, you might find some compatibility. Complexity. Now, can we break down some of the complexity? We do know they're complex systems, but there could be practitioners, there are practitioners, I mean, Sid's a good example, that are willing to take it on and have the capacity and the means to manage those systems. Now, these last two are really important. Trialability and observability. Can we try it out a little bit on a small scale? That's what we observed yesterday. Tim Schwartz property. Cowton Valley. He tried an acre and a half where he thinned back a forest and left about 40 square feet of basal area, right, because he wanted the shade. But he wasn't ready to go full with it, but he wants to expand now because he was able to try it out a little bit. And observability, demonstrations, demonstrations, demonstrations. Nothing is as powerful as going out and seeing it in action, right, on the landscape. Oops. Now, the adopters, the Sid Brantleys of the world, right? This is more of the confirmation. So once they've made the decision to adopt, it's not like you leave them be. You know, technical assistance is a continual process. They need to have a reason to stick with it. Payoffs and markets, right? So those things need to be in place. Adaptation and consistent technical support is important. And then lastly, a sense of relevance. Hey, I'm doing this now. Is it relevant? Okay. So, I mean, those are some of the kind of long-term strategic considerations related to once people adopt, are these things in place so that they have that sense of relevance, they see the payoffs. Here's what we know in terms of requests and ideas from landowners. Demonstrations, demonstrations, demonstrations. All right, do I need to jump up and down? I think I made my point on that one. Active training. Okay, not only for landowners, but also what we're doing today so that we can communicate and learn more about these practices. So in that process of communication, the landowners learn a little bit more. Budget examples, important. And I think Greg hit on some of that. You know, being able to demonstrate some of the budget opportunities and how it all works out in terms of dollars and cents is something that landowners express interest in. Interaction with resource professionals, right? Again, matching the practice with the practitioner and playing a role in that process is critical. And then peer-to-peer education and networking. So we can't do it all, and you know, we're just part of the process. Landowners speaking to landowners, okay, that's also a very powerful tool and something that others that are interested in silvopasture and agroforestry more generally have expressed as being an important part of potentially persuading them to adopt those practices. Now, as far as professionals are concerned, we also need to know more, okay? All of us do. It's a survey in 2005 found that just over half, okay, now we've moved on in some years, but just over half of resource professionals recognize the term silvopasture. All right, so I'm hoping when you, at a minimum, when you leave today, you will at least recognize the term silvopasture. Now, the impact's potentially big. Okay, in terms of the ability for resource professionals, extensionists to engage landowners, but many programs are just starting, and we're part of that. You know, these things don't happen overnight. Discussion, consideration of this as a management tool in your toolkit is something that is starting to get some traction, but we still have a ways to go. There are not many states with an active extension program or private or public consulting. All right, but the old adage holds true, okay, that resource professionals in contact with landowners is a very influential tool. All right, having that conversation. And in terms of agroforestry practices across multiple disciplines is what's required. Now, in terms of initiatives that are underway, here in Virginia, Department of Forestry and NRCS partnered on an open lands initiatives. There were 3 meetings across the state, and agroforestry had a place, and silvopasture was certainly part of the conversation. So here again we see, right, we've got extension, DOF, we've got NRCS there, so we've got soil and water. We've got people from different disciplines, different agencies coming together to have these discussions, thinking in terms of the whole property, all right, and some of the potential for integration of trees, crops, and livestock. More broadly speaking, the National Agroforestry Center, which is a partnership between USDA Forest Service and NRCS, released a strategic framework looking to advance agroforestry as something that's considered in terms of land management, looking at adoption and the research and the communication facets and trying to move forward along those lines so that landowners are more aware of the opportunities and the benefits. Drivers, if we look globally, are diverse in terms of why people might adopt silvopasture or agroforestry more generally, but the benefits and fit are possible. I mean, we see landowners that have taken on these practices and have made them successful. We know many don't know much about them and could probably benefit from more information. Now, they're going to make their decision. But as resource professionals, I think our charge is to be able to communicate some of the opportunities, the potential management practices, so they can make those decisions and then we can move forward to support them. that does it for me. So if there are any questions, how'd I do on time? Oh, look at that. Perfect.
Any questions for John?
I've got a question.
Mm-hmm.
One of the challenges, especially if the silvopasture is going to be implemented from a conservation professional standpoint, so maybe through cost share programs from the NRCS, is that the NRCS guys are strapped for time. They've got more programs than ever before, probably, and so the follow-up maybe would be the missing part. And how do you envision that we could work with an interagency model to have that follow-up?
Yeah.
Because that was one of the points that you made. It's not just implementing the practice, but it's having a follow-up on the practice.
Well, I think some planning and defining monitoring and evaluation is critical, and at certain junctures in the lifespan of, say, any given practice that's implemented. If the first domino is to work through some cost share opportunities, subsidizing these practices to get them up and running, I think that's obviously a good first step and has had great success in places where those things have been put in place. For instance, France in the 90s, agroforestry took off in terms of practice because of the subsidies and cost share that were in place. Now, I know we're all strapped for time, but I think in terms of the monitoring and evaluation and the partnerships across agencies in terms of those points in time where you may want to interface and revisit the plan and consider adaptation or adjustments. In the forestry community, we write long-term management plans, and landowners can go back and visit those plans and look and say, every 5 years I need to mark my boundaries, or maybe at the 15-year mark, that's when we're considering, say, revisiting potential thinning, or that's when we have one prescribed, maybe a couple years in advance of that. So I think in some ways, being able to define the steps that the landowner can take and charging them with that, and then providing information about the diverse agencies or disciplines that can help support some of that may help. And I think that's what they've seen in France. Some of those subsidies were pulled back, but a lot of those systems are still viable because of the fact that they had some long-term planning, and we have to think along those lines when we include trees. So I think the management planning is important. I think that's something to consider. And then in terms of the structure, though, I think we're seeing some increase at the state level related to these projects. And I'm not sure, JB, maybe you can speak more to the time frame or the window related to the establishment of these systems and potential support down the road. I'm not sure how the mechanics work out there. But oftentimes, just defining that long-term planning horizon and thinking about the different points in time where the landowner would want to revisit those, and having those defined at the outset would be beneficial.
Well, I'll add one or two comments related to that specifically. Currently, right now, we put copies of it in